Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have attention, please? All quiet, please. Thank you. All right, so here we go. We're going to get started with the first notes on Cold War, Part 1 of 3. You should have the handout that I attached printed out or available to take a look at. It's 3 pages, and we're going to be going through this during the rest of this particular year. In fact, probably, as I've indicated, we won't get to all of it. Typically, we end up not getting to, say, for example, if you turn to page 2, Indo-Pakistan Wars and the Algerian War. Typically, you do that at the beginning of first semester senior year. So don't worry about that. Those are 2 20th century wars covered in paper 2, topic 11, and we'll get to those. There's also probably on the top of page 2, the Cold War in the Americas. Much of that we're not going to get to as well, although some of those topics will be coming up as we go through the various different notes and videos dealing with the years 1945 to 1960. Some parts, for example, we won't get to, like Canada, Mexico, Brazil. We'll get to that probably early next semester, and a couple of topics on page 1 that we will not get to right away. But basically, what we've got here, Cold War is a big paper 2 topic. Of the paper 2 topics, you've got 20th century wars, you've got the Cold War, and then another paper 2 topic that we'll get to second semester senior year is authoritarian governments. Okay, so you're going to have lots of choices. Well, more choices, a decent amount of choices as far as questions goes. But the Cold War is a huge, huge thing, and we break that up into 3 different units, 1945 to 1960, the one we're doing now, and then from like 61 until 1976, and then 1977 until the very end, roughly 1991. Okay. We're going to be relying heavily on notes, as well as a CNN Cold War series that was done in 1998. Excellent series, and we're going to be using that extensively. I'll give you notes on it, and then you'll have videos that you're going to need to watch, and watch very carefully and take additional notes as necessary. We'll mostly be providing these notes to you as we go along here. Okay, let's see, good. All right, let's see. Oh, and no reading quizzes. I'm not going to mess with that. Okay, so what you should have, what I want you to do is on page 1, we've got kind of an overview, and I want the first notes to deal with this overview. On page 1, we've got the origins of the Cold War, nature of the Cold War, development and impact of the Cold War. We're going to talk about some of those initial concepts, and then some of the concepts that we're going to be looking at throughout the Cold War series, these 3 different units. Okay. So, and we're also going to be relying, let's go ahead and pull this up now. Come on, share screen. I'm clicking on the button. There it is. Okay, there we go. Yeah, this is the series, the Cold War, done by CNN, and it's really exceptional. And yeah, so get with that. Okay, so now we go through. Oh, and yes, we will have lovely Kenneth Branagh being the narrator of our series. He is from Britain. He played the professor in the Harry Potter series. I think, what was he, this in the second one, where he tried to do the mind brain memory charm on people so they would forget things. Anyway, the only thing that you'll notice as I go through here, he does pronounce things in a British way. So when we talk about like nuclear warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles, it's ICBM, it's missiles. He always messes it up by going missiles, whatever. So anyway, we got Kenneth Branagh, who's a very good actor and narrator for this series. Okay, so shall we get into our notes? Let's do this. All right, so the very first topic heading we've got here is origins of the Cold War. Everybody there? We've got 3 bullet points: ideological differences, mutual suspicions and fear, wartime allies to the post-war enemies. These are provided, of course, by IB, and I've got the notes to kind of go along with those ones fairly well. Okay, so how did this get started? How did the Cold War get started? Because Then we got sort of an official date of the Cold War beginning, what, 1945-ish, or several years after the end of World War II. But in fact, some of the animosities were dwelling way, way before then. So for example, as you recall, because we have covered this, when the communists first tried to take control in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, they were not well greeted, obviously, by forces in Russia, folks that supported democracy or the return of the Tsar, and outside forces like the Americans, the British, and the French. We really didn't like that. We were very much ideologically opposed. We liked things like democracy and capitalism. We liked traditional religious beliefs, Christianity, and so forth, or at least the free exercise of religion. And communism supported very different ideals. It was officially atheistic, and ultimately is going to set up a totalitarian state. And so there's going to be some friction right from the get-go. Of course, one of the things that a lot of people in America and the West forget is that we did, take a look at the map here, we did send in troops. We tried to make a difference early on, but of course this was right after World War I, and American population, British, French population was really not that excited about sending troops into a big long battle, which was the Bolshevik Revolution followed by the Russian Civil War. So we pulled out troops fairly quickly, and ultimately the Reds ultimately won pretty much all over the place, except for you did have kind of whites establishing themselves, or at least nationalists establishing independent countries in Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia right in there too. And of course, Poland became independent. Ukraine did not. They got to be part of the Soviet Union. But in any event, make sure you note this. The Soviets were very, very aware of the fact that Western countries, United States, Britain, France, for example, were in opposition to them right from the get-go. So there was some tension there. And in fact, even after the Civil War was over, the United States did not recognize the Soviet government. We did not exchange ambassadors with them. We were kind of hoping, I guess, that maybe they would flip, that the communists would be thrown out. But that reality didn't take place. And write it down, Franklin D. Roosevelt, our president, recognized the Soviet government as the official government of the Soviet Union, Russia, and so forth in 1933. So we began exchanging ambassadors at that point, even though there was still clearly some tension. An interesting thing took place during the 1930s, of course, as Hitler came into power and created this really nasty right-wing fascist Nazi regime in Germany. Nevertheless, it was interesting because some people in the United States, Britain, France, and so forth, they saw perhaps, I don't know, the Soviets as being a greater threat as it went through. Needless to say, the events taking place in the 1930s, where Hitler was trying to take over territories, Austria, parts of Czechoslovakia, and so forth. The British and the French, the Americans were having nothing to do with anything. The British and the French appeased. Remember that? They appeased them. And the Soviets were looking and going, wow, nobody seems to be standing up to Hitler. But they were very concerned that maybe Hitler would turn his attention to and attack the Soviet Union, which in fact did take place. In the meantime, remember this? This was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, okay? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 1939. The Soviets and the Germans made a deal. There's Hitler, there's Stalin. They're cutting a deal basically in 1939 to say, hey, yeah, why don't we just go ahead and split up Poland? And hey, Stalin, you can take the Baltics and Finland, and we'll just not be aggressive toward each other, until later in June of 1941 when Hitler did attack the Soviet Union. And that broke that apart. And of course, we know the United States got involved in the war after Japan attacked in 1941. And then it was like, so why did the United States and the Soviet Union become allies? Yeah, because it was Hitler. He declared war on the United States. So we were on the same side. Yeah, we were friends, United States and the Soviets, for the purpose of defeating Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, okay? But not too much after that, as we talked about toward the end of our last unit on World War II. And in fact, as things were wrapping up in World War II, it was pretty clear that there was going to be some tension. For example, you know, when the Soviets were taking over Poland, there was an uprising by the Poles in Warsaw, and the Soviets just sort of stood back, watched, and let the Germans and the Poles fight each other until the Poles were pretty well crushed, and then the Soviets came in. People figure it made sense. The Soviets wanted to be, Stalin wanted to be in charge of what was going to happen in Poland after World War II. He didn't want to have anything left over from the Polish, you know, governmental system, political system, trying to assert itself as the Nazis were being kicked out. And of course, that goes against, you know, promises made by Stalin that, oh yeah, we'll let the Poles, you know, self-determine who their governments are going to be. Nonsense. He had no interest in that. He wanted to have a friendly puppet communist government established in Poland at the end of World War II or soon thereafter. And we'll look at those details as they play out in Eastern Europe. Let's see, yes. And of course, we had various, well, as we go through, we're going to see plenty of competition going on in Europe. And so this, you know, wartime ally is going to fairly quickly transition into animosity as World War II is over. And there are going to be some key events that will be very pivotal there. For example, the United States is going to be the first to use nuclear weapons, and that's a very powerful weapon, a very powerful thing. And the Soviets are very, very interested in getting it, and they will work really hard, and they will get it. You will have very key events. Well, in fact, we'll have, when we get to episode number 2, the next episode after the one you're watching here, the Iron Curtain, and we'll look at the events associated with Winston Churchill, former British Prime Minister, trying to persuade the United States to take a more stronger position against the Soviets, and giving the Iron Curtain speech in Missouri in the United States in 1946, and creating a lot of pressure and support ultimately within the United States to stand up to the Soviets. Okay, so that's coming up there. Let's go to the next topic area. Nature of the Cold War. We've got 3 bullet points here: ideological opposition, superpowers, spheres of influence, alliances, and diplomacy in the Cold War. Okay, so let's take a look at that. There we go. George Orwell, author of 1984, author of Animal Farm, a man who had seen totalitarian, nasty regimes and political extreme ideologies from multiple perspectives. He didn't like any of them. He was actually the guy who coined the term Cold War. And as we go through and we look at Cold War, it's like cold, it's not a hot war, it's not a lot of fighting. Sometimes there is. There's going to be some hot spots in this war: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan, and a bunch of other ones. And yet there's also going to be like this sort of cold nature, this tension that goes on between the United States and the Soviets. The United States and our allies, and the Soviets and its supporters or client states as we go through here. And, you know, the tension. I mean, what is the goal of the Soviet Union? To spread its ideology throughout the world, but also to protect itself. And when it sees other countries, the United States and others, acting in a way that interferes with protecting themselves, they see it as a threat. Conversely, the United States, Britain, France, and others were trying to spread the idea of democracy and free enterprise and freedom and so forth, and also protect ourselves, our national security interests. So when you have 2 national security interests that are coming into conflict with each other, you're going to get some tension there. And so, you know, when the Soviets leave their troops in Eastern Europe, that looks threatening to Western Europe. When the United States helps to organize a military alliance in Western Europe, the Soviets go, oh, that's a threat to us, and so forth. Oh my gosh, if I'm holding a gun, is it for my defense or is it seen as threatening? Go ahead. Anyway, so there's a lot of tension going on during the Cold War. And thank you very much, George Orwell, for giving us this terminology. course, the interesting thing is occasionally, and you can make note of this, and we'll fill this out as we go through the Cold War, occasionally the United States and the Western side, the free world, will support governments that are not entirely free. We will support some dictatorships as long as those dictatorships are non-communist. We'll see this in the, for example, in the Korean War. South Korea has a definitely non-democratic form of government, but at least they're not communist, so we'll support them. It's going to make it a little bit challenging at times, because when you're for freedom and you end up supporting, at least in the short term, some governments that are not really supporting freedom, that creates some interesting tensions. So yeah, both sides are going to be playing each other off. It's going to be very, very interesting, very complex, and yes, it's going to incorporate the entire world. You know, unlike World War II, that we're mostly talking about Europe and the Pacific. World War I, we were just pretty much talking about, you know, Europe. The Cold War, we're going to be talking about all over the place. Okay, all over the place. And of course, let's see. Superpowers. Yeah, here we go. Who were the two superpowers? Oh, I just told you. Two, the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States is very interesting because this is the first time the United States, after World War II, beginning stages of the Cold War, we step into a political vacuum, a leadership vacuum. Britain is not in a position, even though they've had this, you know, big empire, as did the French, they're not really in a position to be able to lead the effort. The United States is got a much, much bigger economy and is willing. And we'll look at those early stages. Ultimately, we're going to be willing to play a key role as a superpower, economic superpower, but now also a military superpower. Big, huge change from our tactic during the 1920s and 30s, where we were very much America first, isolationist. As we get into the Cold War, we're going to take a leadership role. It's going to be uncomfortable at times, you know, where the British and French are kind of told at times, yeah, the United States is the big leader. On the Soviet side, they're the leader. I mean, they got the Red Army throughout Eastern Europe, and so they're going to be bossing around all their Eastern European allies. We will see some tension develop later on, though, between Soviet Union and communist China, where they're going to be very close initially, but they're going to go their separate ways at times as we go through the Cold War. That's going to be a really interesting thing to follow as we look at the Cold War. Okay. Yeah, so here we go. Sorry, should have had this slide up earlier. There we go. You got the United States with our NATO allies, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, European countries for the most part, as well as Iceland and Canada. But there will be other alliances set up between the United States. They'll vary at times. Some will, you know, switch at various different times. I think at this map here, we've got Somalia and Africa being on our side, but they're going to switch over to the Soviet side. And Ethiopia is on the Soviet side. And so, I mean, actually, I think they were flipped even before that. But you're going to see, this gives you a little bit of a sense of kind of the tensions that are going on throughout. There's an interesting concept here. Let's see, let's go to this one. Yeah, here's another image of an earlier view. Yeah, you can see actually there's the Soviet Union, China, communists coming in there now. The United States definitely is like, yeah, this is the Americas. We don't like having communists on this side. Wait a minute, did this? Oh, check that out. Look right here. 1959, something happened. Oh my gosh, we got red right after our coast. Yeah, this is going to be a bit of a tension when Cuba goes communist. In the early stages here, we've got, oh my gosh, we've got, you know, Western supported South Vietnam. Eventually, we're going to have, oh, looks like the communists have got complete control of Southeast Asia there. So we'll keep an eye on that. Key interesting concept here, spheres of influence. Do you see that there? As part of the second bullet, superpowers and spheres of influence. Spheres of influence, there's this sense of, you know, particularly like the United States sphere of influence. Don't come over, we say to the Soviets, don't come over here to our, the Americas, our hemisphere. You know, it's the whole Monroe Doctrine, stay out of there. So we get really, really nervous when the Soviet Union supports Fidel Castro establishing a communist regime right off our coast. Yeah, we don't like that at all. That's going to get very, very interesting. We'll cover that I don't think we get to that one in this particular unit, but we'll look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s. That's going to come up in Cold War Part 2 of 3. And we'll get all kinds of various different spheres of influence thing. You know, we don't want the Soviets, as far as their sphere of influence, they're like, hey, we got troops right here in Eastern Europe. Don't even mess around with that. Let's get a closer look here. We got troops in Eastern Europe. Don't mess with us. And we, the Soviet Union, they're going to say, hey, we got a sphere of influence right across our borders. And of course, the United States is going to go, well, not in Turkey. They want to have a government that is free of communist influence. So there's going to be a great deal of tension as we and push and pull back and forward as we look at all these various different rivalries. And of course, a key thing, write this down, is something happens right after World War II to the British and French and other European empires. They break apart. Instead of having a relatively, a few dozen countries by the end of World War II, we're going to end up with close to 200 countries as all of these African countries, and East Asian and so forth gain their independence. And then you're going to get Soviets, United States, and so forth competing, trying to get them on their side. Crazy, lots of diplomatic intrigue as we go forward with that. Yeah, okay, next concept. Yes. Oh yeah, now let's look at this. Okay. So keep an eye on the shifting alliances and so forth as we go through the Cold War. Next major heading, development and impact of the Cold War. We got the global spread of Cold War from its European origins. Think of it this way. It's going to be very strange as we go into the Cold War and talk about various different conflicts taking place. Like, for example, in Nicaragua, what kind of government they're going to have in Nicaragua? Who cares, say some people in many parts of the world. But once it gets to be the Cold War, oh my gosh, everything, it's almost like you put on the Cold War glasses. You look at every situation around the world and how is this ultimately going to impact the balance of power between the West and the East. And so you get all of these implications. I mean, who cares if somebody in Chile, if they elect some left-leaning government? I mean, what difference does that make? Well, I don't know. It might tilt things one way, in the superpower balance. So, oh my gosh. All of these things are just going to really, really start to impact how things play out. And we'll look at those in very, very close detail. The second bullet point there in development of impact of the Cold War is called Cold War Policies of Containment, Brinksmanship, Peaceful Coexistence, and later détente. We'll just touch upon these and flesh them out in more detail as we go forward. Let's talk about first the policy of containment. We'll see that come up fairly quickly in the Cold War. See Greece right here and Turkey, they end up being on the side of the United States and members of NATO. But in the early stages, particularly in Greece, after the end of World War II, there was economic calamity, there was concern, there was civil war, there were folks in Greece that were fighting, that were being supported by the Soviets. And then, of course, the Greek government, supported by the United States and Britain, were like, well, what are we going to do to help those guys hold on? The idea that the United States came up with as part of the Western Alliance is to contain the spread of communism so that it doesn't overthrow Western governments. So we put our military and economic strength and support into places like Greece and Italy and France and Turkey, so that those governments are going to be able to be stable and friendly and pro-Western and part of our military alignments. Containment, we'll see that when President Truman issues what is called the Truman Doctrine, the doctrine that basically says, yeah, Greece and Turkey, they're on our side. Soviets don't even think about messing with us, okay? So containment is a very important policy that we'll see in the early Cold War. When we get to the president, Eisenhower comes in after President Truman. He'll be serving from, 1953 until 1961. He serves 8 years, Eisenhower does. His Secretary of State, top foreign policy person, John Foster Dulles puts words to the concept of what is known as Brinksmanship. And this is going to be mostly an early Cold War concept. You can see it right there. I found a nice quote on the ability to get into the verge without getting into the war is necessary art. If you're scared to go to the brink, you're lost. So think of if you've ever seen like some movie or something where they do chicken. You know, we get some kind of car driving on the opposite side of the road, heading straight toward another vehicle, and you know, it's like, what the heck are we going to have? A crash, you know, who's going to turn at the very last minute in this in this thing. So yeah, brinksmanship, the idea that we could potentially have this massive, I mean, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, by the time we get to both sides having plenty of nuclear weapons, we're going to see that maybe brinksmanship is not such a great thing, because if you take it a little bit too close and you go too far, there goes the world, right? Probably one of the best examples of brinksmanship is what's going to be taking place during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where the Soviets have got nuclear missiles in Cuba, pointed at the United States, and the United States is like, we don't think you should have those there, and we're going to have a naval embargo, and we're going to send our ships there, and we're going to intervene with Soviet ships, and what, are we going to have like a major war taking place? Because if you start fighting in the Cuban area, then you're going to fight in Europe, and you're going to fight here, you're going to fight there, and everywhere. So, brinksmanship. Another concept we'll be looking at a little bit further along here is this concept called peaceful coexistence. Keep an eye on this. This is not an early concept. This is going to be one that will come in after Stalin's gone, and you have Khrushchev. Now, he's not necessarily the perfect person to advance this, but the idea is going to be, hey, yeah, maybe when Khrushchev comes in, after a few years in 1956, he and President Eisenhower in the United States are going to go, well, you know, we're not that excited about the fact that those guys are on the other side of the Cold War, but perhaps we could coexist with them and kind of tone things down just a little bit, although we'll see at times things will get pretty crazy. Mao, who's a communist leader, the first communist leader in China from 1949 all the way until he dies in 1976, he's not going to see it so much that way in the early stages. In fact, we'll see Mao as like, let's beat America, let's help North Korea, very much in the Korean War. It's not going to be until, say, 1972. Where he looks and he's like, hey, yeah, I think I can cut a deal with President Nixon of the United States to put some pressure on the Soviets, because the Soviets are getting into my face and I don't really like them so much. So you're going to see some different points of view and perspective as far as what they should really do. Now, these guys, Che Guevara, who is together with Fidel Castro, they're going to be involved in creating the communist revolution in Cuba. They are never really cool about the United States, and they're always looking for opportunities to stick it to the United States. And so we'll keep a close eye on those guys. And by the way, one of them, Castro, is going to actually be a participant in this documentary series. You'll hear him interviewed and answering questions. OPBO, how much can you rely on the words that come out of Castro's mouth? But he does give a very interesting perspective, because his perspective is as the leader of Cuba. Okay, all right. Let's see, next key point. Oh, the role of the United Nations. There we go. Oh, sorry, détente. That's going to come up later on during the time of President Nixon in the 1970s. You don't have to worry about this too much right now. It's a French word. It basically kind of goes along with the idea of reducing tensions between the Soviets and the United States. And we'll see, there'll be some times of reducing tensions, although things will pick back up again in the 1980s. Yeah, that we'll cover that in Cold War Part 3 of 3. Okay, here we go. Role of the United Nations. They're going to be an interesting international organization to take a look at. And we'll perhaps talk about them a little bit more in the early stages. As we mentioned at the end of the World War II unit, they're created by a charter October 24th, 1945 in the city of San Francisco. 51 countries formed together to create a better League of Nations. The first League of Nations didn't work out very well. So now we'll have the United Nations with its headquarters in New York City, and everything's going to work out so much better because they're going to cooperate and da 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 da. And, you know, and it was the United Nations with the support of the United States and everybody else who created allowed for the creation of the State of Israel in 1947. And here's another one. It's very interesting. In 1950, as we'll see when we get to the Korean War, in 1950, the United Nations approved a use of force to stop or repel, I should say, the North Korean invasion of South Korea, which is really kind of interesting because this is like, so when the Korean War is being fought, you have on the one side North Korea versus South Korea, but supporting South Korea is the forces of the United Nations. And then Communist China comes in to help North Korea. Well, it's really weird. It's like, what? I thought, didn't you say at the part of World War II, and when we talked about the United Nations before, that there were 5 veto power members of the Security Council: the United States, Britain, France, Soviet Union, and then of course later China. Was the Communist Chinese are going to get that 5th spot. All it takes is this one of them. Here's a weird thing. Make note of this. The Soviets didn't quite understand how that whole dynamics worked. And when the United States and others were trying to get the United Nations to be in support of South Korea in the Korean War, the Soviets were like, oh, that's terrible, and they walked out, which was the wrong thing to do. And later they'll understand it. They don't need to walk out of anything. The United Nations puts a proposal to support one side that they don't like, they just veto it. And like, but the Soviets will figure that out. So generally, you can write this down. The United Nations is not going to play a huge role predominantly during the Cold War. It's mostly going to be the two sides squaring off against each other, and things aren't necessarily going to be resolved in the United Nations the way it was set up. Okay. There's a thing called the non-aligned movement. These are the countries that at various different times, sometimes throughout the Cold War, are not going to be officially aligned with one side or the other. Okay. You know, they're trying to find an even way. Sometimes they lean a little bit more to one side or the other, but we'll keep an eye on those countries as we go through the entire Cold War. Because you're looking there like, really? Africa is entirely non-aligned? Not so quite. China? Really? Anyway, as we go through, we'll keep an eye on these so-called third world non-aligned countries during the Cold War. Okay. Next topic point, the arms race. This is going to be a fascinating one we'll look at throughout the Cold War. Okay. Because weapons matter. And of course, both sides fairly early on, the United States, obviously before the Soviets, are going to have nuclear weapons. And the initial weapons are dropped from airplanes in the form of a bomb, right? Both sides are going to put tremendous amount of money and energy and resources and spying, if necessary, in the Soviet Union in order to develop these weapons and delivery systems, because you do not want to be in a position where the other side can look and go, oh, wow, we've got these weapons and you're pretty much going to do what we tell you to do. So for example, you can see right here, the United States was first out of the gate with nuclear weapons and quickly developed a lot, and the Soviets are going to be developing them as well. The types of development is going to be as far as the size. You know, the initial nuclear weapons are A bombs, atomic bombs. Later you'll hear about things called H bombs. You're like, what the heck is that? Hydrogen bomb. Oh, is that bigger? Yes, a lot bigger. Lots and lots bigger. Probably one of the key things that is going to be developed as we go through here are the delivery systems, right? Because if you put a bomb in a plane, it's going to take some time to take it across to its intended target. And of course, you can use various different things to try and shoot down these planes. Both sides are going to be working very hard on coming up with the delivery system, say rocket technology, being able to launch a nuclear missile, a bomb strapped into a rocket. And so we're going to watch that very carefully. Anybody know who's the first one to develop rocket technology to launch something that could go like around the planet? Soviets in the 1950s. And so you're going to have a real effort, and we'll look at this closely, a real effort on the part of both sides. But, you know, in the United States, it's like science, technology, and engineering, math, technology. Let's focus on that. Education. It's like the original STEM efforts, because we need to be able to catch up to them. So we'll be looking at these delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. You can launch something that goes up and blows up on the other side. And of course, you're going to be trying to figure out different kinds of technologies that will be even more precise. Instead of just hitting near a target, big boom, hit like directly on the target. And sometimes, you know, there'll be efforts ultimately to develop, you know, a rocket that can shoot up and then go MIRV, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. What? One rocket goes up, 10 to 20 different missiles or bombs, you know, warheads, you know, head for their targets. I mean, it's going to get crazy. By the time we get to the end of the Cold War, you're going to have sides that could have on a submarine a whole group of nuclear missiles, each with MIRV capability. A submarine could take out a country. And of course, the submarines are going to be really hard to find. So one of the things that both sides are going to be doing is trying to, like, you know, hide, you know, from detectable methods of like, oh, I know where their, you know, their missiles are and so forth. Well, if you got a sub that's hidden, you know, off of the water, somewhere deep in the water someplace, it's going to be really hard to know where that is. So we'll keep a close eye on this, the arms race, the technological race. It's going to get very expensive, and it's going to be very interesting. Okay. Now, take a look here. Proliferation of nuclear weapons. Proliferation means basically the spread. So you can see, very handy by this map here, this chart, that the United States is going to have lots and lots of weapons, and the Soviets, and of course, key US allies, the British and the French. And of course, the Chinese are going to have their own. And then there's going to be others that will want to develop their nuclear weapons for their own security. When we talk about India and Pakistan, for example, they're going to be wanting to develop nuclear weapons. Why are they afraid of the Soviets and the United States? No, they're concerned about each other. And Israel concerned about their neighbors, and North Korea. Yeah. Anyway, these red bullets you can see indicate that they do not sign a non-proliferation treaty. Yeah, write that down. There was a movement for non-proliferation. So the countries that had nuclear weapons are basically trying to encourage all the other countries not to develop nuclear weapons, which creates a really serious, interesting challenge, because some countries are like, no, we want to go ahead and develop them. So for example, maybe you can see it right there near Israel, Iran. It's interesting perhaps in developing nuclear weapons. Well, if they do, then maybe some of their antagonistic neighbors, folks that don't trust them, like the Saudis and so forth, they will want to develop nuclear weapons. So there's a concern about the proliferation of weapons, and real big concern about proliferation into the hands of like rogue entities, non-state participants. Think terrorist groups. Think, you know, if Osama bin Laden could get hold of a backpack nuclear weapon, would he and his little group be willing to do it? And if so, like, you know, where's their country of origin? They're from all over the place. So keep an eye on those issues. They're going to be playing out as we look at the entirety of the Cold War. Last bullet point, social, cultural, economic impact. Those are some things we're going to be looking at as we go through all of them. Okay. Now, detailed study. Here we go. As we go through, and these are going to come up in bits and pieces and so forth, and sometimes we'll double back and focus particular attention on some topic, but most of these are very well covered in our CNN Cold War series. And so I'm going to be wrapping up here as you get ready to switch over. I've got the link to watch, take notes on episode number 1. It's actually kind of nice. This one gives you a nice overview of a lot of the things you're very familiar with, and honing in on how things got kind of bad ultimately toward the end of World War II. No surprise. I mean, both sides are kind of looking at things quite a bit differently. Churchill's like, you got to keep an eye on Stalin. Stalin's like, yeah, we don't trust you guys. And, you know, Roosevelt's trying to play it better, you know, in between. But I mean, really, whose side is he on? Ultimately, Roosevelt and Churchill are on the same side as far as for freedom is concerned. Okay, so do take a very, very close look at that. And I'm going to wrap up here with, yeah, oh, the big screen, the big screen. Yeah. Oh, hopefully by this Friday, we'll have an opportunity, and I'll give you more information as we go forward, to, if you would like to touch base, and I'll host a Zoom meeting, a live meeting, where you can like talk to me, and I can talk to you guys and check and see how things are going. I'm thinking of having that probably at about 9 o'clock, and I'll send you the invite and so forth. Yeah, so that if you got questions about your IAs, the research, and everything else you've got going on, that would be really cool. So I did have one other final thing to share with you, and that is an image. I saw this, I guess it was a couple weeks ago. It came, it went, it was on Instagram. It was a thing for a while. I guess the idea was, you know, in the midst of this pandemic, to you know, stick with it, you know, be resolute, and don't be you know, keep step up for left, you know, keep calm, and everything's going to be okay until tomorrow, right? I think that was what it was, until tomorrow. Or was that just like everyone just chill out and don't mind sticking in the craziest picture you could ever think of, until tomorrow, and then you could take it down, or so forth, right? So here's my image that I had taken some time ago. So here you go, ladies and gentlemen, until tomorrow. How's that? Arg. All right, that's it.